Hello all, welcome back to another interesting session. In this video, we are going to see what is continuous integration and continuous deployment using a tool called GitHub Actions. There were many popular CI/CD tools available in the market as of now, like Jenkins, GitLab, Bamboo, Circle CI, TeamCity, etc. And there were also some cloud-specific CI/CD services available. Like for AWS, we have Code Pipeline, and for Azure, we have Azure DevOps. So as of now, in this video, we are going to see like how we are going to achieve this continuous integration and continuous deployment using a tool called GitHub Actions. So let's get into the video now. Before we start the concept of GitHub Actions, we need to have some basic understanding on the CI/CD process and some other tools like Docker and Kubernetes. So coming to Docker we are using for containerization purpose. So in order to run a Docker container, all we require is a Docker image. So this is point number one. And once the Docker image is built, we need a host or a platform so that we can deploy this Docker image and make our application up and running so that it can be accessible from the outer world. So before anyone wants to know the concept of CI/CD, just they have to be aware about this Docker, what is Docker, and what is Kubernetes. Okay, so let's get into the GitHub Actions concept now. So coming to the CI/CD process, let's say a group of developers are working on building an application with some different features that are requested by client. Okay, so they will be maintaining all the code in a centralized location. Okay, let's say a GitHub repository. Okay, we call this as a source code management tool. Okay, where we will be having all the piece of code. Okay, but this code cannot be utilized directly in order to deploy and access the application. So the code has to be packaged into an artifact. It may be a zip file, var file, or tar file. Okay, it will be updated by developers only in the code itself. Like your code has to be packaged into a which format. Okay, now this artifact will be copied into a Docker image. Okay, this Docker image will be built out of a Docker file. Okay, Docker file is nothing but it contains set of instructions like which files has to be copied on which port your application has to run, and when someone consumes this image and tries to run a container, which script has to be executed at the very beginning. Okay, so that your application will be running successfully. So once the Docker image is ready, it will be uploaded to a container registry. Okay, where we will be maintaining different versions, okay, of images, and the required version will be deployed to the Kubernetes environment. Okay, so this Kubernetes we have discussed just before, it's an orchestration tool. Once the application is deployed into the Kubernetes environment, it can be accessed by the end users or clients. So the process of building the code into an artifact and building a Docker image, uploading it to a GitHub container registry or any Docker private registries, okay, it is called as continuous integration. And the process of deploying it into a Kubernetes environment, we call it as continuous delivery or continuous deployment. Okay, hope this is clear. So now let's see how we are going to use the GitHub Actions CI/CD tool. Okay, and how we are going to perform this all different stages in a sequential manner to package our code, build a Docker image, and deploy finally into a Kubernetes cluster so that it can be accessible from the outer world by any clients or end users. Okay, so let's get into the GitHub Actions concept now. Yeah, coming to the GitHub Actions concept. So the workflows will be basically in the form of YAML format. Okay, YAML is the most easiest human readable scripting, which will be in the form of key and value. Okay, and coming to the folder structure, you have to place your workflows in the very base location of your repository. Okay, that in there we need to create a folder structure with a name called .github. Within that folder we need to create a subdirectory that is workflows, and you can put all your workflows over here. Okay, and in order to run your workflow, all we need is a host so that all process will be executed. So for that workspace purpose, this runner concept will come into the picture. Okay, these runners are basically of two types. One is self-hosted and one is GitHub runner. Self-hosted is nothing but if you want to host your own virtual machine within your virtual private cloud as a runner, you can do that. That configuration I'll show you shortly how to do it. And if you want to use any temporary setup and you don't want to set up any kind of runners on your virtual machines in your virtual cloud, you can use the GitHub runners. So what happens is when you start your workflow, a temporary container will be created and all your workspace will be generated over that container, and once your process execution is done, that container will be removed. So this is the concept of runners. Hope this is clear. Yeah, coming to the concept of triggers. So these are the different types of triggers that we use in our day-to-day activities. So when you want to trigger your workflow manually, So we can use a trigger called on workflow dispatch. And when a developer pushes a piece of code to his repository and a workflow should be triggered, in that scenario, we can use on push trigger. So on pushing the code to the repository, this workflow will be triggered automatically. Okay. Similarly, when someone raises a pull request and wants to trigger a workflow as a check PR check, then he can use a trigger called on pull request. So let's say we have two different repositories, repository and repository B. Okay. So if someone wants to call repository B workflows into repository A and wants to execute all the workflows here, okay. So in that scenario, he can use on workflow call in repository B, okay. And coming to the repository dispatch, when someone has a workflow which is in repository B, okay, and he wants to trigger it from repository A, okay, in that scenario he can use the trigger called repository dispatch. Hope this is clear. So coming to the shared workflows, as we have discussed the concept of workflow call, this concept covers in the same concept of triggers as well. So when we are using a workflow call trigger, we are calling some workflows which are in repository B to repository A. So this scenario, when we will do is, we have hundreds of continuous integration repos, okay, where some scans and build process will be very similar, okay. In order to avoid all the similar piece of code that has to be again followed in your workflow, we can put it in some different repository, okay, that is called a shared workflow, maybe shared workflow repo, and you can call it into your CI workflow whenever you want, okay. Suppose if you want to have a scan workflow, instead of writing whole piece of code, you can just call the workflow which is in repository B, that is shared workflow, and you can execute in your CI without adding any piece of code. Just you can call the workflow by passing a set of inputs. That will be enough. So this will avoid the complications, and we can avoid having a lengthy workflow. So let's say we have hundreds of CI repositories, and in each CI repository, the process we follow will be same. Like we'll be checking out the code, we'll be building artifact, we'll be doing some sort of scans and build a Docker image, push to our registry, and update some configurations and so on. Okay, so the process will be same across your org. So the code for scans, for building artifact commands, okay, and building your image, all this will be same. Instead of writing same piece of code in all hundreds of repositories, you can just put the code in the shared repo. Okay, you can create a different repository or maintain a different folder structure in the same repository, and you can place all your workflows. Like see, as I mentioned, this is in shared repo. You can create a folder structure .github workflows, and you can put all your YAML files, your workflow YAML files, scan YAML, build YAML, okay, and for building your Docker images and updating some kind of cons. All your YAMLs you can put it in the shared repo in this path, in this workflows path, and you can call it into your CI workflows instead of putting the entire piece of code and making your workflow complicated. So this will make our life easy. So this is the concept of shared workflows. So coming to the workflow structure, every workflow will should start with a name, which name has to be assigned to that workflow when you want to trigger and you want to identify. Okay, and coming to the triggers, as I mentioned, we have to mention it in the on block when you want to trigger it. As I mentioned, if you want to trigger it manually, you need to mention it on workflow dispatch. Okay, or if you want to trigger it when some developers pushes some piece of code to your repository, then you can use on push, and you can also mention the branches. If you want to trigger your workflow when a piece of code has been pushed to develop branch or QA branch, that branches you can mention. Or else if you want to mention for all the branches, you can mention just star, okay, so that when piece of code pushed to any branch in your repo, within your repo, this workflow will be triggered automatically, okay. And similarly you can do the same for pull request as well, on pull requests for which branch you want, okay. And for every workflow, we will be having certain inputs to pass sometimes, okay. When we are triggering that manually, we want to pass some inputs like image name or image version or any artifact version or anything, okay. So you can pass it via inputs, so it has to be indented this way. Workflow should be indented at least with one or two spaces with the on, and similarly this inputs has also to be indented to this workflow dispatch, and your inputs has to be indented to the inputs with one or two spacings again. Okay, so these your inputs goes on this way, and when you want to describe which type of input it is, you need to mention this way, like if it is a string or if it is a boolean, okay, or if it's a integer or anything, okay, you need to mention its type. You can go through the documentation of GitHub, like how to pass the various types of inputs. And if you want to make this input as a mandatory, without this input, if your workflow shouldn't run, should make this value required as true, so that without passing this value, your workflow will not start. And you can also pass a message, like what is the type of input that a user has to give. You can mention it in the description block. Yeah, hope this is clear till now. So now we have saw like how to pass the name for a workflow, and how to use the different triggers like for manual, on push and on pull, and how we need to pass the inputs and the various indentations that we need to follow that I have mentioned here. Now coming to the environment block, okay, and here we can declare the variables. Okay, variables can be static and dynamic. Okay, so let's say if I have a static environment variable, let's say a sort of scan ID, that may be anything. Okay, I'm saying that this value will be fixed in my workflow no matter how many builds I do. This will be maybe same. Okay, so this is a static value, so I can directly hardcode this way. What if your value is dynamic? Okay, let's say we have different image names for this workflow that you need to pass. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm fetching it from the inputs. So whenever a user want to trigger a workflow, he'll pass this image name as input, and this input name will be assigned to this image name variable. Okay, we need to follow this way: dollar to curly braces, within that inputs dot which input name you want to assign to this variable. So this value from the input will be assigned to this image name, and this can be utilized in the workflow anywhere. Okay, so the two approaches are: one is dynamic variable allocation, static variable allocation. So you can follow this approach. Okay, so now let's get into the job section now. So now we have completed the environment block, okay, in the workflow. Now let's go to the jobs. Jobs are nothing but different stages in your workflow that you want to run. So as we have discussed, there were many stages in your CIE workflow, right from checkout to publishing the image to a Docker container registry. Okay, so let's say we need to declare the stage name, that is your first job name, with the two indentations with the jobs. Okay, this should be small letter jobs, and I'm mentioning it as the checkout. Okay, so for each job, again you need to have a name. If you want to mention, you can give a detail name, or else it will pick up the same name which is over here. Okay, and then you need to mention on which runner it has to run, the runner concept which we have discussed just before. So currently here, for explanation purpose, I'm using the GitHub runner, that is a temporary container which will spin up and which will check out your repository inside that. Okay, so now the various steps that you need to perform within this job, you need to mention that within the steps. Okay, so in steps you can mention the first step name. You can have multiple steps. Okay, for each step also you need to mention the name for recognition purpose easily. So for the first step, I'm mentioning it as a checkout. So here I'm using a word called uses. What uses does is, instead of using the all shell commands, all git commands to clone your repository or everything, GitHub maintains some public actions, GitHub public actions, so you can utilize that directly. So what this feature does is, this will check out your repository to your workspace automatically. Action slash checkout at the rate v4. So as the latest version is v4, I'm modifying this way, I'm using this way. Okay, so this will check out my repository, and after that you can write any number of steps. Let's say I'm modifying some files after checking out my repository, so you need to mention the step name, and after that I want to run multiple shell commands, okay, Linux commands. So what we need to do is, we need to mention run. Okay, run colon, after that you need to mention a pipe. So in the next line, with the two indentations, you can write any number of Linux commands, so you can run them in a sequential manner. So hope this is clear. We can have any number of jobs. Okay, and in each job, these things we need to follow, like on which runner it has to run, which name that job should have, and For each step, what is the name? What if you want to use any public action? Like for checkout, I have used this. So suppose if your project is based out of Node, okay, instead of downloading the Node to your workspace, you can directly use a public action. For everything, there's a public action available in the market. So for setting up the Java, setting up Node, setting up Python, everything just like checkout, we have a public action. You can go to the official documentation, so you can set up your jobs this way. Now we will go ahead and see actual workflow, how it looks like, and we'll compare what all the things we have learned here. So now, as we discussed, here is the sample workflow where we are mentioning the name in the first line as a sample workflow. And on trigger, when I want to trigger my workflow, this is manual trigger workflow dispatch that I'm using in the workflow, and the input name which I'm trying to take for this workflow. So I'm taking image name from the user, and I'm trying to execute the workflow. Okay, it is of string type, and it's required, and I have given a sort of description for the user so that he'll read this and put the input. Okay, and now environment block, as I said, this is the dynamic variable that I'm going to assign by consuming it from the input which user assigns or provide to us, and this is a static environment variable. Okay, so this way we can mention the environment variables in the environment block. And coming to the jobs, so we have multiple jobs, as I said. So for the in the first job checkout, I'm checking out the GitHub repository. So have given the stage with this particular name, git repo checkout, and I'm trying to run it on a temporary container which is of GitHub runner. Okay, so I'm consuming Ubuntu latest, and currently I'm mentioning two steps, okay, just for sample demo. So in the initial stage, I'm using this public actions checkout. So I'm trying to check out the repository, and after that, I'm just trying to run multiple shell commands. Okay. So in order to run multiple shell commands, what I said is to put the run colon, and after that we need to mention a pipe, and you can mention any number of commands this way. Okay. So what I'm doing, I'm just creating a test directory, changing my workspace directory to test, and then copying all the workspace files to this test directory, and then I'm seeing all the files, and I'm checking the current working directory. Okay. Similarly, you can mention any number of stages this way, like build, deploy, everything. Okay. Now what we'll do is we'll upload this file to a GitHub repo, and there we will run a workflow, and let's see the output. So now currently I'm in my GitHub repository where I have multiple Node.js related files like Docker file, and I have written a piece of code for my application. You can consume it and deploy it however. Okay, so here we have a file called package.json. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to write a workflow. As I mentioned, it should be in .github workflows directory. I have written a new file, mybuild.yaml. Okay, and my workflow name is my sample workflow. Okay, and as I mentioned, the code will be same, just have copied from there. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to copy this package.json, okay, from my workspace to this test directory in the same script which I mentioned. Okay, now what I'm doing is I'm just committing this file, and now here if you see this option view runs, click on it, and once you see on your left side of the page, you will find the workflow name which we have committed just now, that with the name called my sample workflow. Okay, this is the option where we need to run the workflow. Okay, on clicking on this, we will be getting two options. Like first one will be the branch name. In the real-time scenario, we will be having hundreds of branches, but in the test repository, I have only one branch, that is master. I'm selecting it, and the image name, okay, that I'm just passing some sample image, and I'm trying to run the workflow. Let's see the outcome. So it is fetching Ubuntu latest. So what it has done, it has downloaded current repository. This all files will be downloaded to this Ubuntu latest container. Okay, this Ubuntu container which is maintained by GitHub, and inside that my files will be downloaded to this particular path. Okay, after that we are trying to run multiple shell commands, right? So we are creating a test directory, we are changing our directory to test, copying the package.json to the test directory, and we are trying to list it. Okay, so what we got in that list, only package.json file is there. Okay, as it is empty, we have copied just this file, we got that in the log, and we are checking the present working directory. So inside your runner, this is the path, this is the workspace where your all files get generated. So this is the test directory that I've created. In this way, you can add any number of stages and run the workflow sequentially and achieve your CI. So now let's see another workflow which I've created earlier. So where I'm trying to take two inputs from the user, that is major version and minor version for my Docker image. Okay, and I'm adding an additional trigger, that is on push. Okay, whenever a push happens to this master branch, this will be automatically triggered, that we are going to see shortly. And environment block, as I said, I'm fetching the dynamic variables from the inputs which user will assign, that is major and minor version. And after that, let's see the jobs. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm building my Docker image and pushing to it a container registry, my own container registry. Okay, what we are doing is we are trying to check out the code. Okay, and after that, as I said, we have many public actions available in the market. So for downloading the node to my workspace, I'm using this action setup node. Okay, it will download the node.js to my workspace, and we can use any node commands within our workspace. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm installing the dependencies which are mentioned in package.json in the node project, and after that I'm running some scripts. Okay, and after that I'm logging into my Docker registry. So my Docker username and password are mentioned in the secrets. Okay, if you have any sensitive information, you can go to settings, and here if you scroll down, there's an option called secrets and variables. Within that, you should select the actions, and you can add your sensitive information like passwords, any type of credentials. And in order to refer this in your workflow, you need to follow this secrets dot that value will call that particular credential. Okay, my Docker password, I have mentioned it as Docker token. Okay, so I'm calling it with secrets dot Docker token, and I'm passing it to this public action. Okay, if you open this public action, you will get to know which inputs you need to pass, customize the inputs. Okay, so this public action requires username and password that I'm passing, and after that what I'm doing is I'm building the Docker image out of this Docker file which I have. Okay, I've written a sample Docker file, so I'm just building it. So for that also we have a public action, and in order to build a image we need a tag, right? So major version and minor version, we are taking it from the users itself. Okay, and this is major and minor, and patch version will be my GitHub run number, that is your build number. Okay, let's say you are building 100th build. Okay, this number will be replaced with 100 build number, I'll show you shortly. Okay, now out of the Docker file we are going to build the Docker image that we are going to see shortly. And I'm going to commit this file, the master branch. If we go to view runs, see this triggered automatically. This got triggered because we have a trigger called on push. And I'm opening this. Now here there will be a catch actually. We didn't pass the inputs major version and minor version, so our image name will something be like, see, major and minor versions are missing, they are blank. Okay, now if I go back, trigger it again, and I'll pass the major version as 3, minor version as 5, and I run the workflow. Okay, I'll refresh it. Hope you got the difference, right? When I'm triggering it manually, I can pass the inputs. Okay, so if you want to pass some inputs, you need to use manual trigger, and if you don't want to pass any kind of triggers, then you can use on push trigger. Okay, now if you see our Docker image, see, the major version which we gave 3 and 5 just got updated with the build number 8. Okay, and if you see, the workflow is success, and image got pushed to the container registry. Okay, what stages happened here? We checked out the code, we have installed the node.js, and we have installed the dependencies required for this build. We have ran some test scripts, we have logged into the Docker container registry, we built the image, and after that what all things we have set up, it will remove automatically. Okay, GitHub has that feature. So that's it for the session, guys. Hope this video is useful in your learning process, and stay tuned to my YouTube channel. In the upcoming video, we are going to see how to use the shared workflows and use multiple environment variables and secrets, and how to use multiple jobs in a complicated workflow. Till then, stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching my video.